the other day, which was probably 20 years ago or so, when I started to discern the diaconate, we were going to some meetings. It was like every once a month on a Sunday afternoon. And the first one we went to, there was about 150 people there. It's a big crowd. But every time we went after that, the crowd got smaller. And eventually, we were at a table, my wife and I were at a table with 6 other couples and a deacon couple, right? And eventually they had to move us to another table because we were the only ones left. But that's how it works, right? So the discernment process is to see that if you feel called to the ministry. So we went through the whole process and filled out the application. And the part of the process is that you have to do 3 interviews. Okay, the first one is with the director of deacons. The second one is with a priest. And the third one, a deacon comes to your house, or the deacon couple, him and his wife, come to your house, and they kind of interview you in your home. I want to see what your house looks like, how well kept you are, or whatever. You know, and it's not about the optics. It's more or less about the faith, right? So I'll never forget that interview because Deacon Sam Barigi came to my house, good friend of mine. And Deacon Sam, you know, went through the questions and all of this kind of stuff. We just had a conversation, more or less. And then he asked me at the end of the interview, he says, "Well, what do you think about the process?" And I said, "Well," I said, I think it's a lot. It's kind of overwhelming." And I said, "I don't feel qualified." And Deacon Sam said something, and I know it's not an original quote of his, because I've heard it so many different times since then. And he says, "You just got to remember, God doesn't always call the qualified, but God always qualifies the called." And I thought about that. And I went through the process. I always said that I was going to go until they told me to stop. They never told me to stop. They just stopped having classes. So, but anyway, now y'all are stuck with me. So, St. Augustine had a quote about the 3 most important virtues in our life, right? And St. Augustine said that the first most important virtue in our life is humility. Then he said the second most important virtue in our life is humility. And the third most important virtue in our life is humility. You see, I think St. Augustine had a sense of humor. But when you really sit down and think about it, that's what God is calling us to be. He's calling us to humble ourselves, to be able to step out of our own little world and be able to see the world around us. You see, the definition of humility is not thinking less of yourself as much as it is thinking of yourself less. In the readings today, we hear 3 different examples of humility, right? In the first reading, Isaiah is in this room and he sees God and all the angels and all of this, and he's afraid because the Jews believed that if you looked upon the face of God, you would die because we're not worthy to look upon the face of God. And the angel came and put that coal upon his lips and cleansed him. Because what did he say? "I am a man of unclean lips, and I live in a people of unclean lips." And then at the end of that first reading, you remember what it says, right? God said, "Who will we send?" And Isaiah had the courage to say, "Here I am, Lord, send me." When God calls us, can we have that courage to be able to make that statement, right? Whenever we're called by the church or by God to do something, can we have that courage? Send me. Here I am. You see, we look at the world and we say, man, look at all the problems in the world today. God needs to do something about it. God needs to send somebody to help fix these problems. Here I am, Lord. Send me. In the gospel, and I love this gospel, but there is a, if you're watching or if you keep up with the series, The Chosen, there is a really good episode about this gospel. And they try to stick to the gospel as close as they can, right? And they're, you know, in the story, Simon Peter is in trouble. He has tax issues. He's in trouble with the Romans. He's got all of his friends. He kind of betrayed some people in his life. And he's trying to catch, he goes out and he tries to catch fish so he can pay his taxes so that the Romans don't throw him in jail. And then he comes into shore the next morning and he meets Jesus. And then Jesus tells him, he says, you know, after he finishes talking, he says, throw your nets out, right? So what does Simon say? Well, Lord, you know, we've been doing this all night and we've caught nothing. How many times in our lives can we look at our life and say, you know what? I'm 63 years old and I haven't accomplished anything yet. And the Lord told him, cast your nets, throw them out into the deep. And in that scene, in that show, it is really awesome because, I mean, the water starts bubbling up around the net, and the nets are filling up and all of this, and then James and John come running out, and they bring their boat, and they fill them all up, and of course, Simon, you know, he always has the wrong thing to say, so they had to add that into to the end of the show, after Jesus had called him, and he says, well, you know, Jesus, maybe we could go fishing a couple of more times. We could make a little money this way. But he paid off his debt. And he was able to follow Jesus. And the rest of them, they dropped everything to follow Jesus. When he said, follow me, they didn't ask, well, you know, wait, Lord, well, let me go do this. Let me go do that. No. They said, yes. Here I am, Lord. And so often in our lives, he calls us. And we don't listen. He calls us, but we have things to do. We have other obligations. We have all of these things. See, the Lord will never ask us for something that is going to put us in a bind, that's going to challenge us in so many ways. He's never going to ask us for everything we have. But what if he does? See, there's one thing to remember about God is an awesome thing, is that God can never be outgiven in charity. Whatever we surrender to him, he's going to give to us 100 times over in blessings. And Paul talks about in the second reading how unworthy he is because he persecuted the church. How unworthy and unfit he is to be an apostle. He gave us most of the New Testament. Because he said, yes, Lord. See, Jesus taught us a great prayer that we overlook so many times. And it's a real small thing, and it's when he was in the garden, and sometimes we overlook it because it was so simple, right? But it's the prayer that we need to learn how to say whenever we're in trouble. It's the prayer that we need to learn how to say when we're going to surrender when God calls us. When Jesus was in the garden and he was on his knees and he was praying, he said, Lord, can this cup pass me by? And then he teaches us a prayer that we miss. He said, but not my will, but yours be done. Can we surrender our will to God? You see, that's what he's calling us. He's not calling us to give up our house, our home, our families. He's calling us to give up our ego. He's calling us to give up our sinfulness. He's calling us to give up those things that interfere with our relationship with him. And we see in the readings, he's going to bless us abundantly. He's going to give us more than we can ever imagine. And he's going to do things with us because he calls us to be his hands. Do we have the courage that we can say like Isaiah, here I am, Lord, send me? Or do we have the courage of Simon, who's not yet Peter yet, but Simon, to say to God, well, Lord, please turn away from me. I am a sinful person. and accept the call. I mean, here was poor Simon, a simple fisherman, and he becomes the head of the church. You know, Simon didn't have an ego. Well, if you look at the story, he kind of had an ego before, but he didn't tell God. When Jesus called him, he didn't say, well, finally somebody recognizes my talent. No. Turn away from me, Lord. I'm not the one. How often do we say that? But God is calling us because He has a plan. God is calling us because He has a purpose in our life. Can we say that prayer that Jesus said in the garden? Whenever we're in trouble, whenever things are great, whenever we need, not my will, but yours be done. Can we surrender our will to Him? Can we surrender our lives to Him and let Him lead us where we need to go? He told Peter, you will be led where you don't want to go. He took Paul from persecuting the church to being one of the great ministers in the church. Do we have the courage? Do we have the strength? Do we have the faith in our life to say what Isaiah says at the end of the first reading? Here I am, Lord. I come to do your will. And can we say with true conviction in our hearts, not my will, but yours be done?